Welcome to the premiere and the pilot of the first no-fly TV show, Climate Action News, brought to you by We Don't Have Time, the social media platform for climate action, in collaboration with Plan International, Our Kids Climate, Earth Day Network, Climate for Connection for Climate, and the Club of Rome. My name is Katarina Rolfsdotter Jansson, and I am the Climate Action News host. This show is all about climate action and solutions, and please stay with us online throughout the show, because afterwards you have the possibility to chat with the experts. The theme for this pilot is sustainable finance for all it's worth, but we'll talk more about that later. Now over to our guests that are with us online here. Please welcome Jill Kubit, co-founder of Kids Climate. We also have with us Nick Nuttall, Director of Strategic Communications, Earth Day Network. And we have with us Sandrine Dixson Decléve from Nice. She's co-president of the Club of Rome. And with us also we have Gabriela Büscher. She's global COO of Plan International. And we have also with us Scott Amix, trend analyst with us from New York, and the founder of We Don't Have Time, Ingmar Rentzog. So Jill, I'd like to start with you. Could you please give us your perspective on climate news from the parents' view?
Yes, thank you, Katarina, and thank you so much for inviting me to the show. I'm a representative of the Our Kids Climate Global Network, which is bringing groups together from around the world to protect the kids that we love from the escalating climate crisis. We first came together in Paris in 2015 at the climate negotiations and have been mostly working in our own home countries and organizing parents. In April of this year, we relaunched our global collaboration with 18 organizations from 10 countries. And what you're about to see is a clip of Gina McCarthy, who spoke at our launch.
You know, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be here with moms, with parents, even dads, people who care about our children, who care about their future. And I am so happy to be here to embrace one another and recognize that we have a challenge and we are going to fight it together. Because we have a collective moral responsibility as well as an individual responsibility to our children. And we have to meet that at all cost. No one has more at stake when it comes to climate change than you and I, except our children.
The idea here is that we know that the kids have been organizing out there through the climate strikes, and we've really witnessed an explosion of youth organizing. But we're also starting to see growing worry among parents and grandparents. And this concern or this worry is turning into action. We've seen hundreds of new parent groups under the banner of Parents for Future that have organized to support the kids, the Fridays for Future school strikers. And we've also seen new groups who have organized that are focused on communications, direct action, and policy. Sometimes these organizations have, the organizing has taken place within existing organizations like Extinction Rebellion or Sunrise Movement or 350.org. And other times it's completely new organizations. And basically what we're doing is we're calling on all parents out there to start organizing.
Thank you so much, Jill Kubit, with us from New York, co-founder of Our Kids Climate. And Nick Nuttall, could you please give us an update from the democracy perspective? You're with us from Berlin.
Nick Nuttall here with the Earth Day Network. It's going to be the anniversary of Earth Day. 1970 was when, I suppose, it was the birth of the environmental movement in terms of citizens coming out. It's now a worldwide phenomenon, but we really want to make it big in 2020 on our 50th anniversary and get at least half the world's population out with purpose to tell their leaders, whether they be leaders of government or whether they be leaders of cities or businesses, that basically we want firm action now to align the world with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And I'm really delighted that you've chosen Climate Solutions for this new TV show. I'm really delighted that the first one is about climate finance, because we know without climate finance, we're always going to be fighting with one hand behind our back. We know there are trillions of dollars out there in the global economy, some of it now pointing into the green economy, into a climate-friendly economy, but it's still very patchy, and we still don't have the kind of scale of finance that's needed. It should be perfectly normal to invest in green infrastructure. It should be perfectly normal to invest in building the resilience of communities. It should be perfectly normal to compensate poor people for the kinds of extreme weather events that we're already seeing. And it should be perfectly normal to have insurance cover in Fiji or Tuvalu or, the African countries. It's not normal right now. It's starting, but it's not fast enough. I think we have a campaign for 2020 called Vote Earth. Vote Earth is about voting in elections for people with strong climate policies. People should check out if those strong climate policies also include financing this transition. And if you're lucky enough to have a pension fund, tell them you don't want to invest in dirty energy anymore. And if you're lucky to have shares in a company, go to their meetings and vote Earth. Vote Earth in a shareholders meeting and tell those companies you want to transition. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick Nuttall. Sandrine Dixson Decléve with us from Nice. Could you please give us an update from a policy perspective?
Absolutely. So thank you for having me on this program. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So already, if you can put up the first slide, please, and you will see that right behind me, I actually have an emergency evacuation plan. I'm in a coffee house. And what we find quite interesting at the Club of Rome, since we have been around for the last 50 years, the first to start to talk about the limits to growth, and the fact that actually we must live differently in order to share this planet equitably across all species. In the autumn, we actually shared on your show and launched our emergency plan. And we are pleased to see that now we actually have 658 jurisdictions across the globe that have adopted emergency declarations. But what we're calling upon at the Club of Rome is the fact that we have to translate these emergency declarations into action. And exactly as Nick indicated, and if you can go to the next slide, you will see that we already have declared in 4 different areas, but we have 10 key solutions where we can unpack moving towards a low carbon economy. Now, what we're seeing is that in the European Union, by 2050, we have to be net zero. And there are many other jurisdictions that have called for net zero and emergency, including the United Kingdom, France, Ireland, and even Canada. But what we just saw a few days ago was that the European Council actually blocked moving to net zero by 2050 because 4 countries voted against it. And this is where we're saying, exactly as you opened, we need the collective responsibility of all governments to put in place the policy now in the next decade that is going to enable us to actually fight this emergency. So we're not saying we can wait until 2050 to be active. We're saying that all those incredible solutions that we have, both in terms of pulling out of fossil fuels, investing in renewables, ensuring that we bring people on board, ensuring that we shift in terms of our materials and the way in which we use materials, all those solutions exist now. We don't necessarily need new technology. And I'll make my last point, which is the fact that we don't have another 50 years. I'm 53. That's my lifetime. So my call and the call of the Club of Rome and many others, including Greta Thunberg, and exactly as others have indicated, we have a collective responsibility now in the next 10 years to work together with governments to put in place the policies that will underpin our transition out of this emergency into an even better civilization. And I am incredibly confident that we can emerge from emergency much stronger and more capable of having greater well-being across all people and being much more resilient to climate change.
Thank you very much, Sandrine Dixson Decléve, with us from Nice. Scott Amix should be with us now from New York. Scott Amix is trend analyst. His focus is on research-based product innovation and technologies. So, Scott, please give us your perspective as a trend analyst on climate action, climate news.
Well, thank you for having me. This is Scott Amix with Amix Ventures. One of the things that I wrote on Forbes is a need to have product innovation to open up the capital floodgates. According to the IFC, which is a private arm of the World Bank, they've established a set of operating principles developed with fund managers and DFIs. And they're trying to harmonize the standards around impact investing, as well as lower the barriers of entry. And some 60 investment groups have signed up for the new code. And collectively, they account for some $350 billion in assets managed in investment impact investing. However, the code does not necessarily guarantee that trillions will be allocated to impact investing. So what is required? What is required is a systematic market approach that enables impact-driven institutional investors to participate with minimal friction. An example of this is, though dissimilar in risk return characteristic, is really the Bitcoin. So before the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, they had difficulties where the institutional investors could not actually participate easily into that marketplace. By having a product investment vehicle, you allow for, in particular, these groups to be able to handle the buying, the storing, the safekeeping of Bitcoins. So similarly, when you think about pension schemes, institutional investors, they all have very different set of requirements. By being able to create a product that specifically supports them so they can easily allow for them to invest is hugely important. The other aspects in terms of news is Michael Bloomberg's latest Beyond Carbon campaign that's promising to deploy about $500 million in capital. But capital is just one side of the equation. Implementation is another piece. We're still relying on 30 to 50-year-old technologies. And according to MIT's Technology Review and Bill Gates' 10 breakthrough technologies, one of those is around carbon dioxide capture or CO2 capture from the air. And do it in a way that's cost-effective and scalable. So one of those interesting creation or inventions is from Joanne Corey, who's been working on this engineering method to be able to allow for plants and trees to retain more carbon by increasing the depth and the growth of the roots. So right now, we release about 727 gigatons of CO2, and most of that is being captured by trees and plants, but there's still a delta. That delta can be addressed through, like I said, a suberin-rich roots that can store more CO2 and keep them sequestered underground for potentially hundreds of years long after the plants and trees are gone. Even
That's amazing.
For example.
That's amazing. Thank you for your point of view from your trend analyst, your point of view in New York, Scott Amix. With us here in Stockholm, we have the founder of We Don't Have Time, Ingmar Renshag. And Ingmar, could you please give us your perspective on climate news from social media aspect?
Thank you, Katarina. I will share my screen and give a short presentation of what has been talked a lot about the climate crisis on internet. So I start with this picture. It's a graph published by the business magazine The Economist that's showing the disruptive way the Greenland ice actually is melting right now. It's a lot of talk about this incident, and what I think is the most interesting is that it's actually a cover story of a big economic newspaper, and more and more business magazines are actually covering the climate crisis, which is a good thing. But a graph is one thing, a picture is another thing. This picture went totally mad on internet, and it's showing the ice on Greenland melting. It's a climate scientist that is collecting data from a weather station, and instead of ice, it's a sea. And it's, as you see, it's really sunny and hot outside. So this picture went really crazy on internet. Another picture that shows the climate crisis all too well is a satellite image took last week from the 6th biggest city in India, where we see that almost all water has dried out. And this is really crucial. And actually, next year, over 21 cities in India, including New Delhi, could be out of groundwater. So even more bad news that is happening through this month is the Canadian permafrost is melting 70 years before it was predicted in climate models. So the climate model is wrong with 70 years in the wrong direction. It's much better than the scientists thought. So we could think of as a good news that Canada sees this and declared a climate emergency last Monday. But I'm sorry to tell, they're not walking the talk, because the day after they approved a big oil pipeline expansion. So that was a lot of talk on internet because it's, of course, hypocrisy. Another person that declared a climate emergency was actually the Pope, and he didn't approve an oil pipeline. Instead, he invited the oil executives to have them act on the climate crisis. I don't know if it's so much action yet, but it's really interesting that the Catholic Church does this because they have 1.3 billion followers. Another big action is the End the Gelä activism in Germany, where over 1,000 climate activists invaded a coal mine and stopped the production. And I think this kind of incidents and risk must be accounted for if you invest in fossil fuel assets. We were going to see probably much more of this activism, and it will cost investors money that is invested in the fossil area. One of the investors that had realized the increased risk with fossil investments is the Norwegian fund that is the biggest sovereign fund in the whole world. They actually decided to de-invest over $10 billion in June. So that's a good news, and it's also something to talk more about on this show.
Thank you very much, Ingmar Renstock, founder of We Don't Have Time. And with us, we also have Gabriela Büscher. She is COO of Plan International, and Plan International works a lot on girls' rights. So, Gabriela, could you please give us your perspective from a gender perspective point of view on climate use?
Thank you, Katarina. I'm very happy. Plan International is very happy to partner today and to be part of this. As an organization, we've been working more than 80 years on child rights. And in the process of working with the most vulnerable communities across the world, we understood that the gender gap was so significant that we would not be making enough progress in development if we didn't really address that vulnerability and gap, and also the opportunity that comes with investing on girls and girls actually being change agents. But also more recently, I would say, we've also understood that all our efforts in development and reducing gender inequality are at threat by climate change. And in reality, the climate crisis exacerbates the differences and the vulnerabilities and has the risk of really rolling back a lot of what we have achieved in terms of gender equality. So we are at all levels very interested in measuring this and understanding the impact. I have here the report that we launched 2 weeks ago on harnessing the power of data for gender equality. It's a gender index on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we did this in partnership with several organizations, including the Gates Foundation and KPMG. And there we see that on all aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals, we are not making enough progress on gender equality, and on climate change is one of the ones where actually there is the least. So we need to have some concerted effort on that.
Gabriela, sorry to interrupt. Could you please show up the report again, because we didn't quite see it?
Okay.
To hold it still for a little bit higher up, closer to the screen. Here we go. Thank you.
And so, now in our work, we work in over 50,000 communities and the most vulnerable communities in 76 countries in the world. And we have seen the effects of the climate change and climate crisis. And what we're doing is working with those communities on mitigating. And we're concerned about the intergenerational injustice that these youth and children in these communities, and particularly girls, are most affected by all the impact of climate change. And of course, they have been the least responsible in the situation, most of not being from the most developed countries and also from being themselves youth and children. So they are most affected also by these extreme weather disasters that are happening, and over 80% of displaced people are girls and women. The latest OCHA report on a humanitarian overview really focuses on the issue of the disproportionate affectation on girls and women on all these extreme weather events. There's issues of malnutrition. Already girls are the last to receive the food at the table because of gender and social norms. They will also be more at risk of abuse and exploitation in these events, and they will have less access to education. And all these issues compound themselves. So you see a girl that is unfortunately a refugee as a result of one of these extreme events, and is abused or exploited, and may be pregnant, and then has less access to education, and then goes into a downward spiral of vulnerability. So it's very concerning for all of us. But the other side of this is that there is also great opportunity to precisely focus on gender issues on this climate change agenda, and make it an opportunity to redress the imbalance if we have all a concerted, deliberate effort on that. And given that it is a systemic disruption, and we all need to change our behavior in order to collectively address the consequences and mitigate the climate impact, then we can also at the same time change those gender norms that can make girls and women be more active leaders in that process. So we have seen already, I'll just finish with saying, we've seen that in the children's movement at the moment is the largest in history, and children are very potent change agents,
yes,
change makers, and there is great opportunity to continue and support so that more in the less privileged communities can also participate in that movement.
Thank you very much, Gabriela Büscher.
Thank you.
And now I'm moving on to a little bit of a panel talk here. All of you in your separate work fields of work are dependent on having your work financed. So what trends do you see in the flow of money when it comes into climate action work, and what needs to be done to funnel even more money from fossil devastation into more climate action? Who would like to answer this? Just put your hand up and I'll unmute you. Sandrine, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk both about finance for ourselves, but also very importantly, the capital that's out there, because I want to build on some of the other points. So the first thing is that building on the economic losses and also the losses of women and gender, let's not forget that women are the first on the front line of drowning from climate events and also flooding, because often women do not know, and girls, how to swim. So that's number one. We know that in Europe, we're going to have actually a tenfold increase to about 34 billion by century's end of costs due to weather and climate. But in addition to that, we also know that the investment gap is about 1.19 to 1.48 trillion from 2031 all the way to 2050. And in Europe in particular, this is huge in terms of transport, water and waste, and energy. So we have a huge challenge of not only getting funding for ourselves to do our work, but most importantly, getting funding to where it needs to go, both in terms of resilience and also in terms of mitigation. The last point that I will make, which is very important, is let's be very clear: 2% of green bonds are part of the bond structure. That's only 2%. And 2% of the oil and gas industry is going into green projects. So we need to remember the capital is there, but it's not going in the right direction. Final point. Yesterday, we launched in Europe the first technical expert group recommendations on disclosure, a taxonomy, and stress testing all of our investments. And this is huge because now investors will know what is green and what is brown. And I think that's very important in terms of ensuring that all the capital flows to the right projects.
Thank you, Sandrine. Gabriela again, and then Nick, please, and then Scott.
Thank you. Yes, so one of the very important things is to redress the balance of investment. We're investing a lot more on mitigation and less on adaptation. So we believe that it's very important to encourage more investment on that, and especially also on the least developed countries. So only 18% of global investment on climate change is coming to those least developed countries. And within all this, we have an opportunity as we move away from the fossil economy to the green economy to consider girls and young women's inclusion in the green economy, so that it's a really transformative change. So it's not in that case about more capital, but in reality making sure that we are using it in the most transformative way so that it's really a sustainable change and we don't reproduce the imbalances that brought us in the first place to this very extractive fossil economy that we're now facing the consequences of. So a lot of the solution is ensuring that there is access to education for girls, but what sort of education? So education that is going to be contributing to a green economy that is more sustainable, and education that is going to give more capabilities and encourage girls' leadership and participation. Because if we don't hear from them about what really is most affecting them, we are at risk that the investments are not targeted in the best way.
Thank you, Gabriela Büscher. Nick Nuttall, please.
I'd love to do a fundraiser for the Earth Day network and say we desperately need money and this is the bank account number, but I won't do that.
Not today.
What I would say is that before I joined the Earth Day Network, I was actually with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we did a global survey with a Danish-based organization called Worldwide Views of citizens' views in just under 100 countries around the world. What did they think was needed for climate action as citizens? And yes, you had green energy, and you had, protecting forests and things like that. But the number one thing that came out was that citizens believe they need more education on this. Education not just at the level of the schools and the universities, but also education in terms of training people for the kinds of green jobs that are needed in this global transition. There are shortages of some of the skill sets that are needed to deliver green energy, for example, and many, many other things. So I think the finance needs to not just go into the technologies that we need or the forests that we will need, but also into human skills that can take part in this transition and also protect themselves, as Gabriella said, in these difficult circumstances. So I think many government ministries and many of those with philanthropic funding should be looking at education in the round to finance this kind of change that we need among people.
Thank you. I know, Scott, you wanted to answer my question, but I'm actually going to move on to the second question and address it directly to you. When it comes to sustainable finance, should we encourage divestments or should we encourage investing, as in owning or influencing? What do you think?
Well, I think what I would say is that we need to look at two dimensions. One is that's being overlooked is who are the ones that's actually providing the capital, and are we looking at it from their perspective? It's very easy to look at it from the point of the NGOs, but we need to look at it from the point of the pension schemes, the insurance, and the institutional. The other side of it is that capital being wisely used? Because at the end of the day, if you want to make significant progress, you have to address the fundamental economics. So let's talk about the pension side. Just like in traditional retirement investments, you have different styles, emerging, international, and so forth, is not all impact investing falls within the similar types of characteristics. Some are going to be great impact, but zero return. Others are going to have asset-based, securitized, and it's going to generate income. And it's going to be better aligned with, let's say, pension liability, for instance. So it's important to look at NGO projects in such a way that it aligns to the actual institutional requirements or the needs. We have to take that into consideration. The product innovation is not looking at what's available, but would they invest it and why would they invest it? Other piece that's important is making sure from a nomenclature, we don't bundle ESG with impact investing. Impact investing is a loose term. And when we're talking about that, it's not a negative filter that we're looking at. We're looking at new, fresh capital that could go into greenfield projects that's going to do exactly what you're talking about. Women, projects, networks, and so forth. The other piece.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you here, Scott, because we have a very tight schedule today. So I need to move over to Ingmar because you were putting your hand up. Thank you very much, Scott.
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page as Scott. I think we're going to see a lot of the investment in the future, not just because of moral reasons, because it's risky assets to have invested in fossil fuels. So I think we're going to see more and more of the investment, and that's great. But we must focus on where that money goes, because I don't see that all those money goes to climate action and climate impact. Most of the money goes to old business that is not fossil intense, like the banks and stuff. And we don't need more banks. We need climate actions. We need to de-invest and make sure the money goes in the right direction and at a positive way. So we create something new, as many of the other speakers have told. So I think that's a very important question.
Thank you. Before I give Sandrine the final word here, I'd like to let Jill Kubit from Our Kids Climate come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring the conversation down to kind of what individual people can do, because we work directly with parents. And I think, as parents or as people, we have the decisions that we're making in terms of how we consume energy, where our energy is coming from, and where our investments are. So I would just really encourage us all out there to really think about what we can do not just because what we do actually reduces our own carbon footprints, but because what we do actually sends signals to other people that this is something that's really important. And those signals that will make changes kind of on the larger social perspective will help change and allow for businesses and for governments to be able to make kind of the big changes that we're talking about.
Thank you very much for Jill, for that perspective. And the final word to Sandrine now.
Thank you so much for the final word. I want to build both on Jill and Scott's point very quickly, and that is that each person can influence this shift, and we're seeing it at different levels. So Jill is absolutely correct. Citizens need to start calling for their rights. What do they want their pension plans to invest in? What do they want their banks to invest in? And they can do that. They can stomp their feet and put their fist down and say, this is what I want. I want it to go into de-risked, non-stranded asset investments. Then the second point is, let's not forget that many of the banks are coming together and starting to call for this. We've got Carney in the United Kingdom at the Bank of England working with a series of other central banks that's saying, actually, the risk is in investing in fossil fuels, exactly as Ingmar has indicated. And we need to shift that risk. We need to count that risk. We need to start to look at externalities and ensure that all our investments are stress tested and that we de-risk actually the investments that are moving into low carbon, into green investments. I think there's a general movement in this direction. I think by working all together, citizens and policymakers and bankers and investors, impact investors and all asset owners, we can really shift the bar, but we need to both disinvest from stranded assets and reinvest into positive assets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandrine Dixson Decléve. And you all be staying online for the chat afterwards with the viewers and listeners.